French President Emmanuel Macron has formally announced that he will run for a second term in office. The announcement comes just 24 hours before a deadline for candidates to finalise their intentions to run. The presidential election is scheduled to be held on the 20th of April.
The Sopra Steria poll shows Macron winning 30.5% of votes in the first round of voting on April 10, up from 26.5% a week earlier. Macron's closest challenger in the first round was Marine Le Pen of the far-right Rassemblement National Party with 14.5% of votes, compared with 15.5% last week. In the second and final vote, due on April 24, Macron was seen beating Le Pen by 59% to 41%. Macron has led European efforts in trying to de-escalate the Ukraine crisis. He met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow last month and has spoken to Putin and US President Joe Biden to try and mediate in the crisis. He has cut taxes for big businesses and the wealthy, loosened labor laws, and marketed France as a startup nation throughout his term. But anti-government yellow vest protests and the COVID-19 pandemic forced him to slow his reform plans.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Harrison Stetler, who's an independent journalist based in Paris. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program. So if these polls are to be believed, it looks as if Macron will be le président for another term.
Indeed, I mean, he's in a strong position. He was in a strong position before the Ukraine crisis broke out, but over the last few weeks, given sort of the changing situation in Europe, he's only been able to present himself more as, I guess, a president for a time of sort of crisis and national instability. But again, the real sort of reasons for, I guess, his strong position now goes back to sort of what's been happening in French politics over the last 5 years, which is more or less a breakdown of sort of the traditional French party system. You have sort of to Macron's left a very disunited, destabilized sort of collection of left-wing parties, and to Macron's right you have essentially a trio of right-wing candidates. And for Macron, this is in many respects a perfect position. He has taken sort of segments of the old center-left and center-right party and essentially unified, I guess, what he has called a centrist political force. And that, I think, is what's really behind his current strength.
So when he was elected the first time, it was regarded, as you say, in a breath of fresh air, in a new way of doing French politics. But that came with promises as well of a new experience for the French people. Has he been able to deliver on that? Is that something that people are going to be considering, or is it more about the people he's up against just haven't come up with anything new?
That's a good question. Just maybe if I could correct. I don't know if I would personally say that Macron, when he won, was truly a sign of, I guess, a breath of fresh air in French politics. But as far as if sort of his promise still holds true, it's a good question, because things in France look very different today relative to, I mean, if we were to go back 2 years, sort of to this moment 2 years ago, right before, I guess, the beginning of the COVID pandemic. I guess the French sort of political preoccupations and what sort of people were speaking about in day-to-day, I guess, French politics was very different. That was back when sort of the government was barely emerging from 3 months of strikes over sort of pension reforms. Needless to say, also after a year of sort of yellow vest protests over environmental injustice, economic inequality. So as far as what Macron's 2017 promise looks like today, I would say even he is somewhat positioning himself more now as sort of a figure of stability, experience, and less as somewhat sort of the transformational sort of centrist president that he presented himself as in 2017. I mean, you saw this in his sort of the letter announcing his candidacy a few days ago. It was very much sort of a much more solemn sort of restrained tone than the 2017 Macron.
So adversity sometimes can create heroes, and presidents often can benefit from a good war or a good crisis that get people to focus away from some of the day-to-day issues. Has COVID-19 and Ukraine worked in his favor?
That's, I think, at least for Ukraine, it's somewhat too early to tell. We'll have to see when sort of the real effects of sort of the economic instability really kick in a few weeks or a few months, how that will sort of really affect, I guess, his position. It's absolutely certain that up to this point, sort of through the Ukraine crisis, he's been able to present himself as sort of a mediating figure. He's only benefited from having sort of an increased international profile as sort of one of the mediators with President Putin and Zelensky. So absolutely, he's been able to take advantage of that to essentially appear as sort of a resolver of crises. But I think that, I guess, is I think a short-term effect, and we'll have to see how sort of one push really comes to shove as far as sort of the economic fallout, what sort of the resolution to the crisis looks like. That's when there'll be sort of a real intense political debate in France about the Ukrainian crisis.
What might be his Achilles heel, do you think, that might be a stumbling block for him going into these elections?
Into these elections, I would say that there are surely two major fears. One, no doubt, is just a rapid degradation of, I guess, the security situation, sort of the economy. If inflation, I guess, spikes at an even more rapid rate over the next few months, if, I guess, maybe the left-wing sort of political parties manage to unify around sort of one political figure, that obviously would sort of horrify a lot of the people in Macron's sort of entourage. But I would say, to their credit, I think they're probably feeling quite confident right now.
All right. He wrote, interestingly, he says, "We've not achieved everything that we set out to do. There are choices that, with experience that I have gained from you, I would probably make differently." What are those things, do you think?
I would say, and the real question, I mean, in the letter that came out a few days ago, he mentioned the question of retirement reforms. One would think, and it's interesting that you noted that elements of the letter. One would think that if you were to sort of rethink sort of something about sort of political strategy, his sort of positioning, he would realize that in sort of French society, there's a desire for sort of greater economic security, sort of reinforcing of public services. One can only hope that's the conclusions he will draw. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily think. I wonder if it'll just be rhetoric, sort of allusion to having learned about the mistakes of of his last, I guess, few years in power. His allusion to reforming the retirement system seems to show that he wants to keep up on that sort of path, which, again, I mean, we shouldn't forget was cause for truly massive protests, strikes, really, which went right up to the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. So I would be cautious about the lessons he will, I guess, have learned from the first 4 years. Obviously, there are allusions to, I guess, increasing teacher pay, increasing certain sort of salaries for certain sort of public sector workers. So maybe there will be some sort of tactical, I guess, concessions to specific groups. But all in all, if he's truly insistent on sort of picking up where he left off right before COVID-19, right before I guess the lockdowns kicked in March 2020, then I would not necessarily say he learned many of those messages.
Is foreign policy an issue for French voters? Here in Africa, we have this love-hate relationship with France over the years, and it really has been challenged in recent times. And I just wonder if this is an issue. And then, of course, there's this whole thing about the French way inside France and how immigrants are supposed to try and become more French and give up some of their cultures to suit the French way. Are these big issues for a French election?
I think, unfortunately, they're issues insofar as they sort of can be shown to be connected to sort of what are considered to be sort of domestic concerns in France. But that's, I mean, I think that's unfortunately a general sort of tendency of many, I guess, democracies is to be quite inward-looking. And France, as you mentioned, sort of allusions to sort of national values, cultural values, civilizational values, has for the last few years really been more or less embroiled in these deep sort of debates over, I guess, what it means to be French. And many of these, I guess, these debates have been spearheaded by, I guess, the new French right. But they've also been fed or instigated as well by members of Macron's government. So as far as interest in foreign policy, of course, I guess there is a major fear of, I guess, where this Ukrainian crisis can really lead. I think we also should not necessarily forget in France that, I guess, French political opinion, and specifically opinion within sort of wide swaths of, I guess, the political class, is very favorable towards, I guess, the desire for a certain kind of entente or a certain sort of indulgence towards Russia. I mean, Macron over the last few years has been very keen on, I guess, presenting France as one of the major designers or guarantors of sort of a new security architecture in Europe. So it's had a sort of gravitational pull in sort of French opinion when it comes to foreign policy. At least when it comes to Russia, is maybe different, somewhat of an exception within sort of the NATO, sort of European countries or the NATO countries.
Do you think that he's done enough to prove to people that he is a leader, that he is a person that can lead France? Because when he was elected the first time, it was more about the new way, change and that kind of thing. And the question about his leadership wasn't really one that was tested so much. But now he's been in the office. Has he been able to convince voters that he can do it?
That's a difficult question. And again, I don't underestimate. I think he's a very clever politician who has a very intelligent reading of the forces in French society. As far as, is he a good leader? Is he the leader that knows how to, I guess, tame the sort of worst natures in French society? That's where I don't necessarily think he is the leader that France necessarily needs at the moment. I mean, if anything, he's been quite indulgent towards, I guess, many of the sort of ultra-nationalist sort of culture war themes that the French right has very successfully brought to the forefront of French politics for the last 5 years. And as far as leadership, when it comes to sort of political leadership and the type of leadership that the French need, it's towards resolving sort of the more bread and butter issues that face sort of average French people: public services, climate change, cost of living. He has shown a tendency to, if not sort of forget those issues, drown them out as well with a series of sort of cultural anxieties.
So he's a good politician by and large. All right.
He's a very good politician.
All right. Perhaps as a final question, we've been talking about Emmanuel Macron, but he will have opponents. What is it about the opponents? Have they been singing from the same hymn sheet for far too long and they're just not coming up with new songs?
I would say if we look at the opposition parties, what's really going on both on the left and on the right is sort of there's a jockeying to decide who's going to be in the best position after the election. I think many people in France, many of the major leaders, be it on the right or the left, have more or less accepted that Macron is going to sort of emerge victorious in April. To both Macron's left and right, I guess there are sort of two forces. You have the sort of Le Pen crowd on the right facing off against two other candidates, and on the left you have sort of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was more or less an equivalent, you could say, maybe to Jeremy Corbyn in England or Bernie Sanders in the United States, sort of a left, sort of far left, sort of a progressive populist, more or less. Are these figures singing the same tune, or have they been sort of running the same line for too long? I don't think so. I think there is a serious attempt on both of these sides to emerge in April in the best position possible, right, to position their force as, I guess, the new pole on the left and right. Once Macron is, I guess, a second-term incumbent, and I guess, as we'd say in the United States, a lame duck president.
Harrison, thank you so much indeed. I know some of those questions may have been a little unfair, but thank you so much indeed for giving us some insights. Merci beaucoup pour ton temps.
Thank you for having me.
Au revoir.
Have a nice night. Bye.
All right, that's independent analyst there, Harrison Stetler, speaking to us about the upcoming French elections. And it looks as if the polls are to be believed, Emmanuel Macron will be president for another term.